This is part 2 of the video illustrating the analytic planning worksheet, and it focuses on the bottom section of the worksheet. We continue using the third phase of the Defining Mass Observation project and show how an analytic task is translated into tools when using NVivo. So here's the worksheet for phase 3 of the Defining Mass Observation project, and you can see that the top sections are already filled in, which is what we covered in part 1 of this video. The bottom section of the worksheet has 4 areas, and we fill them out one at a time, first from left to right, and then finally the bottom reflection section. First, on the left is an area for noting the task that is being translated. As you read in Chapter 2, analytic tasks are individual self-contained steps of action, and they result out of each iteration of the overall plan. In Chapter 6, we discuss writing analytic tasks at the appropriate level of detail for the purposes of translation, so that the units and purposes within them are easily identifiable or jump out at you. This makes translating tasks and filling out the next part of the worksheet easier. So I'll just put the task that we're going to translate in this video in here. And now we're ready to move to the right and fill out the next area. This area of the worksheet is where translation happens, and it contains 5 headings to help go through the first 4 steps of translation. As you know from Chapter 6, the first step of translation is to identify the units in the task. There's lots of discussion and examples in that chapter about the importance of units, and we distinguish between different types of unit just to help you think them through for the purposes of translation. This analytic task has 2 units, so conforms to our rule of thumb for the number of units to have in each task for the purpose of translation. When you're doing this yourself, you may need to rewrite the task so the units jump out. If it's helpful, you can note the type of unit in this space in the worksheet, as I'm doing here. But it's not actually necessary to do this because the type of unit has no relevance to later steps of translation. In other words, the type of unit doesn't affect which components could be or are used to accomplish a task. Having identified the units in our task, we now describe the purposes of the task. Remember, this is important to prevent us from acting without focus or reason. To help describe purposes, it's useful to refer to the context of the task that we filled out in the top part of the worksheet. So, for example, we can see that at this point in the project, we had previously familiarised with the content of sample transcripts, so we had some idea of the concepts that we may expect to find in the dataset as a whole. These are what we call the potential concepts, and they were predefined as part of the previous phase. We can also see that we're expecting the next phase to include planning the analysis. Finally, referring back to the top part of the worksheet reminds us that generating a conceptual framework is the intended outcome of this phase of work. These aspects of strategy inform step 2 of translation, helping us to think explicitly about our purposes, and this is why the top part of the worksheet is always there. In Chapter 6, we say that the rule of thumb is to have only one purpose per task. But you can see that in this example there are 2. Remember that rules of thumb are just heuristics, or guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules that must not be broken. It makes sense for this task to include 2 purposes, because whilst deciding whether our predetermined potential concepts are present, we may expect to see other concepts we haven't yet thought of. This is because in this project the data we're using wasn't collected by the research team specifically for the purpose of this particular project. Rather, it was generated previously for a different purpose. Therefore, we weren't familiar with the data before we started the planning stage that this phase of work is part of. If we stuck to the rule of thumb of one purpose, we would need to split this task into 2. so that we first look for the predetermined concepts and then, as a separate second task, look to see if there are any other emerging concepts we haven't yet thought of. In reality, though, this doesn't make much sense, as we will inevitably see emerging concepts whilst looking for the predetermined ones. So breaking the rule of thumb in this case is entirely appropriate. The rules of thumb are just there to help learn translation. We don't need to let them artificially change the practice of what we do. Now we've identified the units and described the purposes, we're ready to identify potential components, step 3 of translation. And this involves first thinking through which software components can be used to represent each unit, and then thinking about whether the purpose of the task involves writing or visualizing. There are several components that could be used to represent concepts and transcripts, so I'll pop those in the worksheet. And we always consider the components that can be harnessed for writing and visualizing. The final 2 headings in the translation column help accomplish step 4 of translation. You'll know from reading chapter 6 that choosing appropriate components means evaluating the possible components identified in step 3 in terms of the actions that can be taken on those components and the context of the task. We fill out these 2 parts of the worksheet in tandem. The explanation area is designed to keep notes about why the choices were made. This will be especially helpful the first few times you go through the process, but of course you can choose to stop writing these explanations once you've got the hang of translation. As well as listing actions that can be taken on components to facilitate this decision-making process, Chapter 6 describes in detail what we mean by the context of analytic tasks, and the 4 points to consider in taking context into account when choosing appropriate components. So I'll just fill out these 2 areas. I'm not going to talk through the thinking process for this task in this video, but you can download this worksheet and study it in detail together with the overview of the Defining Mass Observation project. The 5th and final step of translation is finalising selected or constructed tools that act on the chosen components, thereby fulfilling the task. And this is what the final right-hand column is for. Remember that the difference between selected and constructed tools is also just a learning heuristic, and the distinction between the 2 fades with growing experience in translation. In this example, we're constructing a tool because our task has 2 purposes and is better fulfilled by combining software operations into a larger constructed tool rather than artificially splitting the task into 2 separate tasks. For this task, we actually carried on and undertook several other tasks, and you can see those translated in the worksheet that you can download. For now, I'm just going to skip over those and move down to the final area of the worksheet called Reflections. This area is a space you can optionally fill out to note your reflections about the progress of the phase as a whole. You don't have to use this area of the worksheet, it's not necessary to the process of translation, but because qualitative analysis is iterative, it's often useful to keep notes about what's happening, because often we change our minds, we go down different routes, unexpected things happen, and therefore it's useful to keep track of that kind of iteration, especially when using these worksheets to document your whole project. So again, I'm going to pop in the reflections for this phase, which includes the other tasks that were accomplished, not just the one we've translated in this video. This completes the video explaining the analytic planning worksheet. As I said earlier, you can download a worksheet template for your own use, and there are also several filled out worksheets on the website that you can download and study to draw analogies for your own project needs. Please also refer to Chapter 6, which takes you through the worksheet using the sample task from the Imagined Bullying project.